I worked my whole life as an accountant, saved for retirement, paid my mortgage on time, and believed that a home was where you were loved, where you were safe. When my son Michael lost his job, I said, "Move in with me. You'll get back on your feet." He came, with his wife and kids. They took the bedrooms. I moved into the living room. I cooked, cleaned, paid the bills. And I didn't complain. Until one day, in front of his friends, he said, "Old people don't belong in a house where children are growing up." He said that, standing in my house, looking into the eyes of the woman who once held him in her arms. I didn't say a word, but a week later, he held an envelope in his hands with a letter and a notice. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Margaret Brooks, and I was 68 years old when my son called me, his voice low and unsteady, and told me he'd been let go. It was a Thursday in early spring, the kind of day that pretends to be warm, but still carries winter's chill in the breeze. I was in the kitchen, sorting the mail with the radio humming in the background, when the phone rang. He said it was temporary, that the company was downsizing, that he'd get back on his feet soon. I heard the silence after each sentence, the way his breath caught when he tried to sound hopeful. I didn't hesitate. I told him to come stay with me, that the house was big enough, that it would give him time to look for new opportunities. He thanked me quickly, like he was embarrassed. I told him it was nothing, that this is what family is for. I had owned my home in Cedar Falls, Iowa, for over 30 years. A modest two-story with faded blue shutters and a porch swing Harold built before his knees gave out. We bought it in 1987, back when interest rates were still brutal and we thought we'd never afford new furniture. But we made it work. Over the decades, it had become more than a house. It was a map of everything we'd survived. Harold had passed 10 years earlier. The kids had moved out long before that. The space had grown quieter with time, but it never felt lonely. I had my routines, my books, my baking, and my flower beds. Michael arrived 3 days after that phone call. He didn't come alone. His wife, Jessica, and their two kids trailed behind him like a weary parade. I hadn't known they were all coming. I hadn't asked. I told myself it didn't matter. Family was family. You make room. They pulled into the driveway in a rental truck, boxes stacked in the back like this was a permanent move. Jessica didn't look at me when she stepped out. She was on her phone, barking at one of the kids. Michael hugged me, quick and distracted, already scanning the house as if measuring its square footage. The boys ran up the front steps and disappeared inside without saying a word. I helped them carry boxes. Michael said they'd just need a few weeks, maybe a month. That once he was back on track, they'd find their own place. Jessica never said anything about that. She just asked where the bedrooms were. I gave them the upstairs, all 3 bedrooms. I moved my mattress into the living room, told them I liked the sun coming in through the big windows in the morning. Jessica didn't comment. Michael looked relieved. At night, I lay on the floor beside the coffee table, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned slowly overhead. The house no longer felt like mine. The walls had become thinner somehow, as if the echo of other people's voices could push them apart. But I reminded myself, this was temporary. This was the right thing. I woke early every morning to make coffee and breakfast. Jessica liked almond milk. Michael needed his eggs scrambled a certain way. The boys refused anything that wasn't toaster waffles. I adjusted. I stopped buying the brands I preferred. I shifted my schedule so the bathroom wouldn't be occupied when they got up. I learned to make myself invisible in my own kitchen. Jessica brought in new throw pillows for the couch, reorganized the spice rack, removed the framed photo of Harold and me from the mantel, and replaced it with a digital clock. "It's more practical," she said. I didn't argue. Michael spent his days on the phone in the upstairs office. He said he was applying for jobs, talking to recruiters. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. But the weeks passed, and nothing changed. The job offers never came. The rental truck was returned. Their kids enrolled in the local school, for now. I started to notice small shifts. My favorite armchair disappeared from the corner of the living room. Jessica said it was falling apart. My sewing basket was moved into the garage to make room. The curtains I'd picked out years ago were replaced. Jessica said they were dusty and outdated. It didn't happen all at once. It was gradual, like the slow fading of color in a favorite quilt after years of washing. One day I reached for the mug I always used for tea, and it was gone. Another day, I heard Jessica refer to the house as theirs on a call with her sister. Still, I said nothing. I reminded myself that this was what mothers did. They sacrificed. They made space. They swallowed the small indignities because love required flexibility. I had never been one to demand. I had always been the one who gave. But one evening, as I sat alone at the dining table, a plate of dinner growing cold in front of me, while the rest of them laughed upstairs over takeout they hadn't invited me to share, something shifted. I looked around the room and saw none of myself there anymore. No photos, no books, no traces, just silence and borrowed furniture. That night, for the first time in my life, I wrote my name in the center of a piece of paper. Then I circled it, drew a border around it, a boundary, because I had opened my door in love. But what had entered was not gratitude. It was entitlement, and it had taken root. The changes came slowly, like water rising in a glass, quiet at first, barely noticeable, until it reached the edge and began to spill. I kept telling myself it was still my house, but the signs that it wasn't anymore grew harder to ignore. It began with routines. I used to wake up early and make coffee before sunrise. The house would be quiet, still asleep, and I cherished those peaceful minutes. Just me, the hum of the fridge, and the warm clink of the spoon against my favorite mug. But after Michael's family settled in, mornings became a rush of noise. Jessica started getting up before me, claiming the kitchen like a battlefield. She had reorganized the drawers without asking, moved the teaspoons, swapped out the mugs, tucked my cloth napkins in a box, and stashed them in the garage. The coffee maker was replaced with something sleek and digital, the kind that whirred and hissed and made the entire kitchen smell like burnt beans. I asked once where my old drip pot had gone. Jessica smiled and said it was outdated, then added, "You'll love this one. It's automatic." She never asked if I wanted it to be. They brought in furniture, too. Michael's old leather couch, still worn from their last apartment, was placed in the center of my living room. My flowered love seat was moved into the garage, along with the armchair that Harold used to nap in. Jessica bought a new rug, bright and geometric, clashing with the muted tones I'd carefully chosen over the years. When I mentioned the contrast, she laughed and said the old one was too vintage. The pictures on the walls changed. Family portraits I had hung, Harold in his Navy uniform, the kids when they were small, even my parents' wedding photo, were taken down and replaced with abstract prints from a store downtown. There was no discussion. They just appeared one day. Mine were neatly stacked in a box, labeled Margaret's Keepsakes, as if I had passed away and someone was packing up what was left. Jessica began calling it our home when she spoke on the phone. I overheard her telling a friend that they were finally settling in and that the space was perfect for the boys. I was standing 10 feet away, setting the table. She didn't flinch, didn't correct herself. Michael didn't say much at all. He moved through the house with a quiet sort of ownership, like someone who had been handed keys to something that no longer needed to be earned. When I asked if he'd heard back from any of the interviews, he always said something vague. It's in the works. Or next week, maybe? I stopped asking after a while. I spent more time in my bedroom, or rather, the room I'd turned into mine after giving up the master to them. It was small, crowded with things I refused to store in the garage. My dresser, the rocking chair, a few bookshelves. The closet was packed tight, half my clothes still folded in bins beneath the bed. I would sit there with a cup of lukewarm tea, listening to the footsteps upstairs, the laughter, the music, the television blaring through walls that no longer felt like they were protecting me. Even meals changed. I used to cook dinner every night. Simple, comforting things like roasted chicken or beef stew. Jessica started insisting on meal planning. She had charts, gluten-free this, organic that. The boys were picky, and I was expected to accommodate. When I made meatloaf one night, something Michael used to love as a child, she wrinkled her nose and said, "It's not really what we eat anymore." So I stopped cooking. I ate my meals later, alone at the table, while they piled dirty dishes in the sink and left the kitchen without a word. I wiped down the counters when no one was looking. I took out the trash. I folded the towels. I kept the house running like a ghost, invisible in the corners, haunting the rooms I used to own. Once, I tried to reclaim a little space. I hung a small photo of Harold and me back up in the hallway. The next morning, it was gone. I found it on top of the washing machine. No one mentioned it. I told myself it was temporary, that eventually Michael would find work and they'd move out, that all I had to do was endure it a little longer. But each day, the house grew more foreign. I had opened the door to help them, and they had moved in like I was no longer part of the equation. It was a strange thing to live inside your own home and feel like a guest. Stranger still to realize you weren't even treated as that. Just background, support, silent infrastructure. I had become the floor beneath their feet, and not one of them noticed when they stepped on me. There's a moment when quiet frustration becomes something else. Not rage, not sorrow, but a colder, quieter shift, a recognition that something fundamental has broken. That moment came for me on a Wednesday afternoon, when I tried to take a shower in the bathroom I had used for over 30 years and found the door locked. Jessica's voice came from behind it, sharp and annoyed. She said the boys were using the bathroom and I'd have to wait. I stood there in my robe, towel in hand, unsure whether to laugh or cry. It was my bathroom, in my home, and yet I found myself apologizing as I stepped away. I didn't speak to anyone for the rest of the day. I went to my room, if it could still be called that, and stared at the small patch of floor that wasn't covered in storage bins or displaced furniture. That's when I opened my notebook, the one I'd kept hidden beneath a stack of old quilting magazines. It had started as a grocery list, a place to jot down doctor's appointments or birthdays, but now it became something else entirely. I began writing down everything: dates, expenses, who used what, when and how, who bought groceries, who paid the electric bill, who left dirty dishes on the counter, who treated me like a tenant in my own life. It wasn't petty, it was evidence, and it wasn't for them. It was for me. I had spent my entire adult life keeping records. I was a school accountant for over 30 years. Budgets, audits, spreadsheets. That was my world. I knew how to track value. I knew how to trace loss. And now, for the first time, I started accounting for the intangible things: space, respect, acknowledgement. My ledger wasn't about numbers anymore. It was about boundaries. The next day, I walked into the kitchen and found that someone had used the last of the milk. Again, the boys had eaten the last of the bread. Jessica had left a sticky note on the fridge that read, "Please get oat milk next time. Regular upsets Dylan's stomach." No, please, no offer to reimburse, just instructions. I stood there staring at the note, the refrigerator humming behind it, and I realized something painfully simple. I wasn't part of the household. I was its help. That night, I waited until everyone was asleep. Then I walked through the house and took stock of everything that was missing. My reading lamp, the framed cross stitch from my mother, the antique clock from the hallway, all boxed and stored somewhere or simply discarded without a word. I opened the hallway closet and found my winter coat shoved behind Michael's golf clubs. I pulled it out, dusted it off, and hung it by the front door. I didn't plan on going anywhere, but I wanted to see it there. I wanted one small thing to mark that I still existed here. The next morning, Jessica moved it back. That same afternoon, I overheard her talking on the phone again. Her voice was low, but the words carried. We'd love to move, but it's complicated. She's still here, and Mike doesn't want to force it. We're doing our best. Still here. Still, like I was some relic gathering dust. An obstacle, not a person. That evening, I sat down at the dining table after they had eaten and left their mess. I cleared the dishes, wiped the crumbs, and lit a candle, just one, for myself. I poured a glass of wine and wrote again in my notebook. I didn't just log what had happened. I asked myself what I was waiting for. Why was I still acting like this was temporary? Why was I letting myself be erased? I knew the answer. It wasn't love. It wasn't fear. It was habit. It was the old script, the one that says mothers make space, that we bend, stretch, absorb, that we swallow the hard things and call them sacrifice, but sacrifice without acknowledgement isn't noble. It's surrender. And I was done surrendering. That night, I placed my notebook in the drawer beside my bed. I stood in front of the mirror and stared at my reflection, searching for the version of myself I used to be. The one who managed a school budget down to the penny, who raised 2 kids on a single income, who buried a husband and never asked for help. She was still there, just quiet, just waiting. The next morning, I put a sticky note on the fridge of my own. It read, "Rent is due on the 1st." I didn't sign it. I didn't have to. The day of the dinner party started like any other, with Jessica issuing commands and Michael avoiding eye contact. I wasn't told there would be guests. I found out when I overheard Jessica on the phone, talking about wine pairings and asking someone to bring a gluten-free dessert. She walked past me in the hallway and said, "We're having a few people over tonight," like it was an afterthought. No invitation, no request, just notice. I spent the morning in my room, the small room, the one they referred to as the extra room when talking to others, as if I were a distant cousin on an extended visit. I read the same page of a book 3 times, but couldn't absorb the words. The house buzzed with activity, vacuuming, the clink of wine glasses, the smell of garlic and lemon wafting from the kitchen. I wasn't asked to help. I wasn't asked to leave. I was just expected to stay out of the way. By evening, the house was filled with voices I didn't recognize. Laughter rang from the living room, loud and casual, the kind that carries confidence and comfort. I stayed in the hallway halfway down the stairs, just out of sight. I don't know why I lingered. Maybe I wanted to hear something that would remind me this was still my home. Maybe I hoped for acknowledgement. Instead, I heard Michael. He was standing near the kitchen island, drink in hand, surrounded by friends. His voice was relaxed, comfortable in the center of attention. "Old people just don't belong in houses with kids," he said. "It's not good for either side. We need space to raise our boys, to live our lives." Someone laughed. Another voice chimed in. "Totally." It's exhausting trying to manage both ends of the age spectrum. Michael continued, "We've been thinking about moving, but it's complicated. You know how it is when there's legacy stuff involved." Legacy. That's what I was now, a burden dressed in sentiment. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The words hit me with a heat that started in my chest and rose to my face. Not anger, not quite. It was something deeper, something older, a sadness so heavy it pulled at the base of my spine. He said it like I wasn't there, because to him, I wasn't. I was background, history, the soft furniture in the corner no one sits on anymore. When the laughter died down and the conversation drifted to other things, stocks, sports, someone's new kitchen remodel, I stepped back up the stairs. Slowly, quietly, I went to the bathroom and locked the door. I sat on the closed lid of the toilet and stared at the tiles I had scrubbed for 30 years. I counted the hairline cracks in the grout. I tried to remember how long ago I had stopped being seen. That night, I didn't eat dinner. I waited until the house had gone still again, the guests long gone, the glasses drying on the counter. I made myself a sandwich in the dark, ate it at the kitchen table with only the light from the microwave to see by. I didn't cry, I didn't rage, but something inside me settled, solidified. I went to my room and opened the bottom drawer of my desk, took out the folder I had started weeks ago. I added a page to the back. Date, time, quote. I wrote it down word for word, his voice etched into the lines like ink that would never fade. Then I wrote a single sentence beneath it. He no longer lives here, not yet a fact, but soon. Because something had shifted, the same way frost hardens the edges of a leaf, and when it breaks clean. The morning after the dinner party was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that lingers after something has been broken and everyone pretends it isn't lying in pieces on the floor. I heard the kids get ready for school. Jessica's voice carried lightly through the hallway, chipper and polished. Michael didn't speak much. He moved through the house like a man walking through smoke, not quite sure what was still burning. I didn't join them. I waited until the house was empty again before I emerged from my room. The kitchen still smelled like wine and garlic. There were a few dirty plates in the sink, and a crumpled napkin lay on the counter. I didn't clean it. I poured myself a cup of coffee from the pot Jessica had left half full, added a splash of cream, and sat at the table in the same spot where Michael had stood the night before, erasing me with his words. The air was thick with decision. I felt it in my fingertips, in the rhythm of my breath. Something had changed, and I was no longer willing to pretend otherwise. I took my coffee to the living room and opened the drawer of the end table. Inside was the file I had been quietly building. I had labeled it in small, neat print, House, Legal. It was filled with bank statements, tax records, utility bills in my name, the mortgage release documents, everything that proved what I already knew, that this house was mine, purchased and paid off long before Jessica ever entered the picture, before Michael had finished college, before his boys were born. I made a call to an attorney that morning. Her name was Meredith Holloway, and she had been recommended by a neighbor who went through something similar with her own daughter. I explained my situation briefly, and she didn't sound surprised. She told me she'd seen it more than once. Children who forget their parents' humanity the moment they need something from them. We met the next day. Her office was calm and warm, filled with quiet light and the faint scent of eucalyptus. I brought the file with me, along with my journal and a list of everything that had been said and done in the last 2 months. Meredith listened carefully, asked precise questions, and made notes in a narrow spiral-bound notebook with a pink leather cover. When I finished, she looked up and said, "We'll get your house back, officially." That word, officially, stuck with me, because I had never truly lost the house, not on paper, but I had lost it in presence, in voice, in dignity. What I wanted now was not just control. I wanted recognition. I wanted boundaries defined by ink and law, not just politeness and hope. We filed a notice of termination of informal tenancy. Meredith drafted a letter that explained in plain terms that Michael and his family had 30 days to vacate the property. It was formal but not cruel, clear but not vindictive. It was the kind of letter that left no room for argument, only action. We sent it via certified mail. I placed a second copy in an envelope and left it on the kitchen counter beneath the salt shaker. That night, I didn't say anything. I ate my dinner in the sunroom, listening to the soft rustle of leaves outside the window and the occasional creak of floorboards upstairs. I went to bed early, slept deeply. The next morning, Michael was waiting in the kitchen. The envelope was open on the table. He looked pale, confused, like someone who had stumbled into the middle of a conversation they hadn't been paying attention to. He asked me if I was serious. I told him I was. He said, "But this is our home now." I said, "It never stopped being mine." Jessica came in midway through the conversation. She was livid. She accused me of betrayal, of cruelty, of turning my back on my own blood. I let her speak, let the venom spill out across the tile, and when she was done, I told her they had 4 weeks, not because I had to, but because I was choosing to. She called it heartless, but what they had done to me was not heartless. It was mindless. It was the slow grind of entitlement, the belief that because I had given once, I would always give, that because I had stayed silent, I would never speak. They forgot I had been a professional my whole life, that I knew how to read contracts, how to enforce boundaries, how to document everything. They forgot I had a spine. The letter was just a piece of paper, but it was also the line in the sand, and they had crossed it. I expected rage. I expected pleading. I even expected silence, one of those cold, punishing silences that people use when they believe you've wronged them. What I didn't expect was denial. After the letter, things didn't explode. They frayed. Michael didn't raise his voice. He didn't storm out. He simply acted like nothing had happened. He continued to make coffee in the morning, walked past me without acknowledgement, and spoke in soft, clipped sentences as if we were two co-workers trapped in the same office but working on entirely separate projects. Jessica reacted differently. She was louder, more performative. She complained more openly, not to me, but around me, about the size of the kitchen, about the outdated appliances, about the lack of space, and how it was starting to feel cramped. She mentioned to Michael loud enough for me to hear that maybe they should have just taken that apartment on Oak Street when they had the chance. But neither of them packed a single box. A week passed, then another. I watched the calendar. I watched the clock. I watched the house begin to fold inward under the weight of the unspoken. It was late afternoon when it happened. I was in the garden, kneeling in the dirt beside the roses. I had let the garden go a little over the winter, but with spring arriving, I'd returned to it like someone returning to a beloved book. It was the one place on the property that still felt fully mine, untouched by their rearranging hands. I was pruning back a stubborn thorn branch when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned and saw Michael standing there, hands in his pockets, his face uncertain. He asked me what I was doing. I said I was trimming the roses. He said, "You still do that?" I looked at him and nodded. He stood there for a while. Then he said something that caught me off guard. He said he thought I was bluffing. I didn't respond. I kept working. Then he said he didn't know where they would go. Not as an accusation, not even with bitterness. Just a quiet truth floating in the air between us like a leaf with nowhere to land. I sat back on my heels and wiped my hands on my jeans. The sun was behind him, so I couldn't see his eyes clearly, but I could tell he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the ground, the soil, the roses, anything but my face. I told him I was sorry for that, but I also told him I wasn't sorry for protecting my home. He said they'd try to be out by the end of the month. I said that was good. He nodded and walked away. That night, Jessica slammed a cabinet door so hard, one of the glasses rattled off the shelf and shattered on the floor. She didn't clean it up. I did, not because I was giving in, but because I didn't want to leave broken things lying around. A few days later, I came home from the grocery store and found Michael sitting at the kitchen table, alone. His laptop was closed, a half-empty cup of coffee in front of him. He said he'd found a place. It wasn't much, but it was close to the boys' school. He asked if I'd mind helping with the security deposit, just a small loan. I looked at him for a long time. Then I said no. It was the first time I'd ever said no to my son when he asked for help. The word felt heavy in my mouth, like a stone. But once I said it, I didn't take it back. He didn't argue. He just nodded, slowly, like he had been expecting it all along. The next morning, I found a stack of empty boxes in the garage. They had started packing. There was a strange quiet in the house after that. Not tension, not relief. Something in between. A countdown, maybe. Or a long exhale after years of holding in a breath. The surprise wasn't that they were leaving. The surprise was how natural it felt to let them go. The silence came gradually, like mist rolling in through an open window. It didn't rush in or announce itself. It simply settled. One morning, I woke and realized the house sounded different. No cartoons blaring from the living room. No hurried footsteps on the stairs. No Jessica's voice calling over the clatter of dishes. Just quiet. They had left 3 days earlier. The last box had gone into Michael's car around sunset. Jessica hadn't said goodbye. She barely looked at me. The boys gave me half-hearted hugs, distracted and unsure. Michael was the only one who said anything that resembled a farewell. He thanked me for everything, but his voice was thin, like tissue stretched too far. I didn't respond. I just nodded. After the door closed behind them, I stood in the foyer for a long time. The late evening sun streamed through the stained glass panel above the door, scattering bits of amber and blue across the floor. The silence inside the house didn't feel like an absence at first. It felt like a question. What now? The next morning, I got up early and made coffee the way I used to, with the old drip pot I had rescued from the back of the pantry. I found my favorite mug, the one with the chip on the rim, and sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around it, letting the warmth seep into my fingers. For the first time in months, I didn't have to wait for anyone to finish in the bathroom. I didn't have to check if someone had eaten the last of the eggs or moved the salt to another shelf. I didn't have to tiptoe around noise or space or presence. I simply existed in my home, unobstructed. That silence became its own kind of company. I walked through the house slowly, room by room, reacquainting myself with spaces that had felt foreign under someone else's rhythm. I opened the doors they always kept closed, dusted shelves that had held things I didn't recognize, rearranged furniture that had been turned to face televisions instead of windows. In my bedroom, my real bedroom, I stripped the linens and opened the windows. The air smelled like rain and cut grass. I aired out the closets. I folded my sweaters the way I liked, not the way Jessica had insisted was better for space. I returned my books to their rightful place, alphabetized by author, not color. I found little things they had left behind, crumbs of a life that no longer belonged here. A pair of socks behind the dresser, a broken toy in the corner of the guest room, a list Jessica had written and taped to the fridge, full of notes about bills, cleaning days, schedules for the boys. I pulled it down, folded it once, and threw it away. For a few days, I didn't speak to anyone. Not because I was upset, but because I needed the stillness. I needed to hear my own breath in the space. I needed to know that I wasn't echoing through someone else's life. I went to the grocery store and bought what I liked. Thick yogurt, sourdough bread, strawberries, even though they weren't on sale. I didn't look at the price of the oat milk. I didn't have to. I listened to classical music in the kitchen. I danced once, barefoot while I waited for the water to boil. I laughed out loud when I dropped a spoon and it clattered dramatically to the tile, startling the dog. I hadn't laughed like that in months. That Saturday, I sat in the garden with my pruning shears and trimmed the rose bushes. The petals were just beginning to open, their soft edges trembling in the breeze. I worked slowly, deliberately, each cut a small reclaiming. The soil was warm beneath my knees, and the sun kissed the back of my neck. I closed my eyes and let it linger. Neighbors began to wave again. A few stopped to chat. One of them, Claire from 2 doors down, asked if I was alone again, with a sympathetic tilt of her head. I smiled and said, "No, just back to normal." Later that evening, I sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea and watched the light fade behind the trees. The house behind me was clean, quiet, whole. The silence was no longer empty. It was mine. There was a stillness to the house now, but it wasn't the kind that comes with loneliness. It was the kind that breathes slowly, evenly, like someone finally resting after a long illness. Every room seemed to have taken a breath the moment the front door closed behind them. The walls relaxed. The air softened. The corners where light used to be swallowed now glowed in the mornings. I moved through it like someone rediscovering a language she hadn't spoken in years. I took off my shoes without worrying about tripping over someone's backpack. I turned the radio on as loud as I liked. I read aloud from my books again, not to anyone in particular, just to the walls, to the air, to myself. The rooms felt larger but not empty. They were filled with my pace, my rhythm, the familiar sounds of cabinet doors, the creak of the floor by the hall closet, the low hum of the refrigerator. They no longer held tension or forced politeness. They held presence. I repainted the downstairs bathroom a pale lavender. I'd always wanted to, but Jessica once said it would make the room feel outdated. I chose the color myself, went to the hardware store, picked up the paint and brushes and drop cloths. I sang while I painted, out of tune and a little too loud. The dog sat in the doorway, watching me like I was someone new. I rearranged the living room, pulled my old armchair back in from the garage and placed it by the window, just where Harold used to sit. The cushion had a worn spot, but it was still the most comfortable chair in the house. I placed a side table next to it with my reading lamp, a coaster for tea, and the small clock with the ticking sound Jessica always said gave her a headache. I unpacked the boxes of my things, not the ones I needed, but the ones I had loved. The ceramic dish from my honeymoon in Oregon, the quilt my sister had made me 30 years ago, the photo albums with pages that crinkled slightly when turned. I laid them all out, not as decoration, but as proof. Proof that I had been here all along, that this was my space, not just in name, but in spirit. On Sunday morning, I woke before dawn and baked a blueberry pie, just for me. The kitchen filled with the smell of butter and sugar and warm fruit, and I sat at the table and ate a slice with my fingers, still warm, the juice staining my fingertips. I didn't bother with a plate. Later, I called a locksmith and had the locks changed. Not out of fear, but to complete the ritual, to draw the final line. A new key, a new door sound, a new version of coming home. The silence of the house was now a friend. It greeted me each morning like a fresh page. I no longer flinched at shadows moving behind me. I no longer felt the need to apologize for walking into my own kitchen. I no longer asked permission to open the windows or play my music. The mailbox was filled with things addressed only to me again. The bills had my name. The return address labels I ordered came in the mail, and I smiled when I peeled the first one and placed it on a letter to an old friend. My handwriting, still strong and neat, still mine. People sometimes ask me if I miss them, if it feels strange to be alone again. But the truth is, I'm not alone. I'm accompanied by peace, by memory. by a quiet sense of having done what was hard and having come through it with my dignity intact. This house has seen many versions of me: wife, mother, widow, provider, forgiver, ghost. But now it sees me as I am, a woman with space, with voice, with time. I often sit on the front porch as the sun sets, a book in my lap, the dog curled at my feet. Neighbors walk by, some wave, some stop to chat. I nod, I smile, I answer questions about the garden or the weather. But the best conversations are the ones I have in my head, quiet, unhurried, grounded. Because now, after everything, I can finally say it without hesitation. This is my house, and I am home,